If Russia continues to sustain losses in Ukraine at the current level, it'll run out of combat vehicles in 6 months or less. That headline blared from a February 2024 Yahoo News piece pulled from the New Voice of Ukraine, claiming that Russia found itself losing around 80 armored personnel carriers, or APCs, per month in 2022 and 2023. Over 23 months of fighting, that amounts to 1,840 vehicles, and if it continues, the losses will stack up to the point where Russia can't keep up. After all, it's producing between 30 and 40 APCs a month. If it loses 80 for every 40 it produces, it'll eventually experience an equipment shortfall that could massively hinder its efforts to take Ukraine. But is that really what's happening? And if so, how long does Russia have until it runs out of equipment and either has to pull out of Ukraine or start relying on other means of sourcing its equipment that it's using to try to take the country? Those are the questions we'll answer in this video, and we'll start by taking a look at something crucial. How much equipment has Russia actually lost in Ukraine? The numbers vary depending on the sources, and there appears to be no consensus on how much Russia has lost. For instance, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS, suggests that Putin's forces lost around 3,000 armored fighting vehicles, including the APCs mentioned earlier, in 2023 alone, with total losses amounting to 8,800 over the first 24 months of the war. However, it also points out how difficult it is to properly track ground-based losses compared to air and naval equipment losses. Take the Black Sea Fleet for an example. Because of the relatively small size of the fleet, at least compared to the thousands of armored vehicles and tanks that Russia has on the ground in Ukraine, every loss can be easily measured. But even then, the waters are a touch murky. Oryx, a Dutch website that tallies both Russian and Ukrainian equipment losses, says that Russia lost 21 ships and submarines to damage or outright sinking. Ukraine's number is slightly higher, it says 24, which demonstrates that some loss figures will also be subject to inflation for propaganda purposes. Still, the difference is small enough for us to easily say Russia lost around 20 of its Black Sea Fleet thanks to Ukraine's attacks on its navy. That's not the case with ground-based equipment. For instance, the numbers provided by Minus Rus, which offers equipment loss figures updated daily and with support from NATO's Special Operations Forces, suggests that the losses are much higher than the IISS states. It says that Russia has lost 13,575 armored combat vehicles in Ukraine, a near total loss of the 13,758 it claims Russia has in its arsenal. But it's these comparisons that showcase how murky the numbers can be. Minus Rus also claims that Russia has lost 7,087 tanks in Ukraine, which is more than double the numbers that the very same resource claims that the country has in reserve. A similar situation is seen with artillery, with Minus Rus claiming 11,356 losses and stating that the Russian military has 5,689 artillery pieces. How are those numbers even possible? Either estimates of the amount of equipment Russia has had at its disposal before the war's outbreak are inaccurate, suggesting Moscow is far better equipped than was previously believed, or the loss numbers are being inflated, perhaps for the aforementioned propaganda purposes. Alternatively, these strange numbers could be emblematic of the difficulties of tracking on-ground equipment losses. After all, Minus Rus's figures seem far more realistic regarding ships, helicopters, and aircraft. It claims 26 naval losses, a similar figure to the numbers reported by other sources relating to the Black Sea Fleet, as well as 347 aircraft losses and 325 helicopter losses. All of those losses easily align with Russia's stock in these cases. For instance, the 26 lost ships and boats represent 5% of the 519 naval assets Minus Rus claims that Russia has at its disposal. The same goes for the aircraft and helicopter figures. Toward the end of February 2024, the BBC reported that Ukraine claimed to have shot down 342 Russian planes and 325 helicopters. Again, these figures match Minus Rus, or at least come very close to matching, which would suggest it's reliably tracking losses. Still, there are clear disparities here, which only leads to the confusion surrounding the true state of Russia's equipment stockpiles. But there is one certain takeaway from all of this. Russia has lost a lot of equipment in the 2+ years since it invaded Ukraine. The question is now, how much is left over? Minus Rus attempts to answer that question by pointing to Russia's military stockpiles. But if that resource is to be believed, Russia has already burned through all of its tanks, artillery, and the vast majority of its armored combat vehicles, so we need to dig deeper. Along with minus Rus, we can look into global firepower, or GFP, to get numbers for Russia's current stockpile. Every year, GFP produces its Power Index, which ranks over 140 countries in terms of military strength. Beyond personnel, it also looks at equipment numbers for land, naval, and aerial equipment, perhaps giving us a more accurate picture of Russia's losses in the context of its military strength. Through GFP, we see that Russia may not actually be in danger of running out of equipment. Let's start with air power. GFP claims that Russia has 4,255 aircraft at its disposal, with 2,766 of those craft being in a state of combat readiness. This includes 809 fighters, 526 of which are ready to fight, and 730 attack-type aircraft. GFP also claims Russia has 1,006 combat-ready helicopters, along with 363 attack helicopters that could be used to attack Ukraine. That's not too far off of minus Russia's claims. Combine its stockpile numbers for aircraft and helicopters, and you get 2,340 aerial assets. GFP puts number at 2,766 combat-ready assets, with around 1,500 more needing maintenance, refurbishment, or repairs before they can go to the battlefield. Thus, we can safely estimate that Russia has burned through a quarter and a third of its aerial stock. We see similar alignment, though not as close on the naval front. Minus Rus states that Russia has 519 ships and submarines, with GFP stating the number is closer to 780. Either way, Russia's losses in this area are negligible. Beyond the Black Sea Fleet, against which Ukraine has successfully defended, Moscow hasn't really used its naval assets in the war. So if we assume an estimate of 25 ships lost is correct, we can say that Russia has lost only between 2 and 5% of its naval equipment based on the sources found earlier. No danger of running out. But that means little when it's equipment Russia isn't actively using in the war. GFP's ground equipment figures are far more illuminating. Take tanks, for instance. GFP says Russia has 14,777 tanks, about 10,340 combat-ready. That's a far higher number than the 3,300 that minus Rus claims that Russia has available. And it also makes minus Rus's claim of 7,087 tanks lost make a little more sense. With estimates of tank losses ranging between 3,000 and 7,000, we can now say Russia has lost somewhere between a third and 70% of the tanks in Ukraine. We also see similarly large numbers in terms of military vehicles. GFP says Russia has 112,967 combat-ready military vehicles, which includes the APCs mentioned earlier, alongside an array of transports and smaller vehicles in its stockpiles. That's far higher than the 13,758 vehicles minus Rus estimates. And again, it puts minus Rus's estimate of 13,575 armored combat vehicle losses in a different light. Russia hasn't lost 98.7% of its military vehicles. The number is closer to 10%, at least if we consider GFP's figures. As for artillery, Russia seems to have experienced massive losses in that department, no matter where you look. If we take minus Rus's figure of 11,356 lost artillery units as a given, that amounts to most of Russia's stockpiles, even when we bring GFP into the fold. Combining self-propelled, rocket, and towed artillery numbers, GFP claims Russia has 12,341 combat-ready units, or had. Given that 11,000 of those units have supposedly been lost in Ukraine, it's here where we see an actual equipment shortfall starting to occur. Every assault Russia leads requires artillery, and it's losing pieces at a rate of around 10 to 15 per day, if those numbers are accurate. Granted, it has more in reserve. GFP says Russia has 17,629 pieces of artillery spread across the three categories mentioned earlier, meaning it currently has 5,288 units that aren't ready to send to Ukraine. Again, repairs, maintenance, or simply completing manufacturing could bolster its numbers. Of course, there are other factors at play here. For example, Russia isn't going to deploy every piece of equipment it has to Ukraine, especially on the ground. While it may have 100,000 armored vehicles at its disposal, it's likely only willing to dedicate a small percentage of those vehicles to the conflict. And even if it were willing to send tens of thousands more, it would still have to navigate clear roads into the country and could end up losing even more than it has if it's unable to find those roads. Nevertheless, even with all those factors in place, we can reiterate one thing for certain. Russia has lost a lot of equipment, and even though it's making inroads slowly, such as the taking of Avdiivka, every step forward comes at the cost of soldiers and equipment that Russia can ill afford to lose. Which brings us back to the question that started the video. How long does Russia have until it runs out of equipment? Taking the numbers given by GFP, Russia would be in no danger of running out of equipment soon. Granted, its artillery numbers are looking weak, and it's burning through tanks at a high rate. But the country would still have enough in the tank to keep pushing for at least another year, right? Not necessarily. As various outlets suggest, Russia's rate of production simply isn't keeping up with its immense losses in Ukraine. Take Forbes, for instance. In February 2023, it published an article suggesting Russia could run out of tanks in 2 or 3 years. Given the article's publication date, Russia will be out of tanks completely by 2025 or 2026. The article points to Russia's early decision to bolster its frontline ground forces with an enormous 2,500 tanks in February, including T-72, T-80, and T-90s. A year later, Russia had already lost 1,600 of those tanks, giving it a loss rate of a little over 4 tanks per day. That alone places a burden on Moscow. The country needs to replenish those lost stocks and even took steps in 2023 to make that replenishment happen. The Kremlin ordered 2 of Russia's largest tank makers, Uralvagonzavod and Omsk-Transmash, to produce more tanks to replace those already lost. But there is a problem. Neither company has the large-scale manufacturing capabilities to produce tanks to match or exceed the numbers Russia is losing in Ukraine. Uralvagonzavod, for example, is only able to manufacture around 250 tanks annually, a tiny patch on the numbers that Russia's losing every year. Forbes also sheds light on the number of tanks that Russia has in its storage. Though Russia has around 10,000 supposedly combat-ready tanks, the storage conditions used for those tanks are subpar. Many are lined up tread to tread in vast outdoor parks where they're exposed to rain, snow, and the constant cycles of hot and cold that any country experiences during the changing seasons. That is a problem for the materials used to make tanks. Metals rust when exposed to water, or even just moisture in the air for too long. Rubber rots, optics and the complex electronics inside the tanks degrade over time as well. So as large as Russia's tank fleet may be, it can't escape the damage that's been done due to lax storage protocols. One analyst estimate suggests that only about a third of the T-72s Russia has in storage are recoverable, with about half of its stock of 1,500 T-80s in a place where they can be made combat-ready. The T-90s don't fare as poorly. They're newer tanks after all, but those numbers suggest that GFP's estimates of Russia's tank stockpiles aren't as impressive as they first appear. So it starts looking like Russia is fast running out of tanks. Finally, the Forbes article does some additional math. It claims that Uralvagonzavod and Omsk-Transmash can refurbish up to 600 tanks per year in addition to manufacturing 250 new tanks. The calculation, 1,600 minus 850 equals 750. In other words, Russia's losses of tanks at a rate of 1,600 per year and only production and refurbishing rate of 850 annually means it has a deficit of 750 tanks. But that was in 2023. Had anything changed by the same time in 2024? Apparently not, at least if a January 2024 Forbes article written by the same author as the 2023 article previously mentioned is anything to go by. That article suggests that Russia has lost 2,619 tanks by the 23-month mark of the war with Ukraine. It has slowed the rot a little. 2023 brought with it a little over 1,000 losses, but it hadn't brought the losses under enough control to allow for production and refurbishment to exceed use. In fact, if Russia couldn't refurbish its old tanks, the article argues, it would be left with just 368 to continue its assault on Ukraine in 2024. The 2024 article does highlight that the Kremlin claims the production is far higher than the 250 tanks per year that the 2023 article estimated. According to Moscow, it produced around 1,500 new or modernized tanks in 2023, which it says is 1,000 more than the previous year. That would be high enough to overcome the 1,000-plus losses of 2023 and leave Russia with a 500-tank reserve, assuming the Kremlin's numbers are accurate. They may not be, at least according to ARI, a French open-source intelligence cell that claims Russia only makes 390 tanks per year and showed no signs of speeding that production up in 2023. Again, we have propaganda and inflated figures coming into the mix. Though we can now at least draw one seemingly accurate conclusion from all of these numbers. Russia is losing tanks at such an alarming rate and may not be recovering them through production that it might soon run out. That leaves Russia with the option of slowing down its frontline assaults to give itself some time to produce more tanks, giving Ukrainian forces a chance to further fortify in the process. Alternatively, it can push forward, potentially losing hundreds more tanks in the process, and possibly burn through the reserves it has until the war essentially screeches to a halt. And there's another problem. Right now, Russia appears to be keeping its equipment inventory levels at least somewhat stable by refurbishing old equipment before introducing it to the front. According to a CNN report, reactivating old systems has been key to the Russian war effort over the last 2 years. You can probably see the issue here. Old inventory is finite. Russia might have thousands of tanks along with other equipment that it can modernize and send to Ukraine. However, those old stockpiles will dwindle with each new refreshment effort, leading to Moscow relying on older and more obsolete pieces if it continues to rely on this strategy. Given the volume of support Ukraine receives from overseas countries, the U.S. alone is likely to send a further $60 billion after the Senate passed a foreign aid bill in February 2023. Russia faces another problem. It's sending increasingly aging equipment to fight a war with a country backed by other nations sending more modern equipment. Even if Moscow can sustain its numbers advantage for the next 2 to 3 years, which is how long sources like the IISS and CNN claim Russia has before it runs out, it will find itself dealing with the obsolescence problem. If Ukraine has better equipment, the Russian numbers won't matter. Kyiv will just hunker down, defend fortifications, and slowly whittle away at the increasingly older equipment that Russia throws its way. So the situation looks grim for Moscow. Though GFP figures suggest it has a lot of equipment in reserve, more in-depth analysis suggests that this equipment is old, perhaps even unusable, and may force Russia into a quantity over quality approach that has the potential to backfire. All of this leads to another question. What is Russia doing about these equipment problems? Ramping up equipment production is one approach. However, the success of Moscow in this area is up for debate. We've already discussed the estimates that Russia is producing far fewer tanks than it needs to replenish its numbers on the front lines. It's also refitting older tanks to send them to Ukraine, though the numbers have been up in the air, given the supposedly terrible conditions in which it's been storing these tanks. However, the story coming out of Russia is very different. In September 2023, Reuters reported that Vladimir Putin ordered the ramping up of military hardware production across the board to ensure Russia could achieve its goal of taking Ukraine in its, quote, special military operation. According to Bekhan Azdov, the industrial director of the Russian arms manufacturer Rostec, that order has seen production volumes increase by between 2 and 10 times across all lines of military hardware. We are going forward at cruising speed, Azdov claimed. Smoke from all the pipes. He went on to point out that there has been significant growth in the production of armored vehicles, tanks, artillery, rocket launchers, and missiles. However, there was one crucial piece of information missing from his statement: numbers. Azdov refused to deliver any specific numbers to Reuters, which may be telling in its own right. After all, the Russian propaganda machine would surely be delighted to let Ukraine and the rest of the world know if it was producing equipment at a high enough rate to ensure it could maintain its threat. The lack of concrete numbers may suggest that production, even if it has legitimately increased by 10 times in some areas, may not be especially impressive. After all, 10 times only means something when stacked against a number. There's a big difference between multiplying production by 10 times when you were previously making 100 units per year than there is if you were making 1,000, a 9,000 unit difference to be exact. But without real solid numbers from Russia, we can't know what this ramping up of military production really means. Nevertheless, it is clear that Russia is ramping up production. At the beginning of 2024, Euromaidan Press reported that 2023 saw Russia's defense industry employ a total of 3.5 million workers, amounting to an addition of around 520,000 people if figures from The Guardian are accurate. On top of that personnel increase, Russia also supposedly expanded its existing production lines and increased shift patterns, meaning people are now working longer hours in better facilities to produce equipment. Mandatory 12-hour shifts now appear to be the norm, with Russia also offering double overtime for anybody who goes over their 12 hours. Russia also has ramped up its production of artillery shells. The Guardian reports production falls somewhere between 2.5 and 5 million shells per year, However, the usefulness of those shells, if Russia continues to lose artillery units at a high rate, as suggested by sources like Minus Rus, would be anybody's guess. Still, the point is simple. Russia is investing heavily in production, and in 2024, it will likely spend $112 billion, around 6% of its gross domestic product, on defense. In addition to that increased production, which may or may not be enough to provide all of the equipment Russia needs to sustain its war, depending on who you listen to, Russia also appears to be taking a page out of Ukraine's book. It's increasingly relying on foreign sources for equipment. At least that's according to soldiers on the ground in Ukraine. In April 2023, Reuters reported that Ukrainian soldiers are increasingly finding Chinese-made components inside weapons and equipment. Specifically, the article points to the navigation systems built into the Orlan aerial drones Russia was using during that period. The drones typically have a Swiss-made guidance system. According to Ukraine, a similar situation is seen in some Russian tanks. For instance, fire control systems in some destroyed tanks were found to contain Chinese parts rather than the French parts they were supposed to have. Perhaps that doesn't seem like such a big deal. After all, Russia could have bought the Chinese components simply because they're cheaper than the Swiss and French equivalents. Besides, as Reuters says, the reports are unverified as they come solely from Ukrainian experts. Perhaps we're seeing propaganda at play again here. Or maybe we're seeing China go against its own word when it claimed it wouldn't supply Russia with equipment for its war. The case for the latter becomes stronger based on a Politico report from July 2023, claiming to have obtained customs records showing that a Chinese company, Shanghai H-Win, has supplied hundreds of thousands of helmets and bulletproof vests to Russian buyers. It also highlights that Russia has imported around $100 million worth of drones from China in the first half of 2023. Granted, you could argue this is all non-lethal equipment, ignoring the possibility of the drones being repurposed, and that this equipment is available to any buyer. China certainly doesn't seem to be providing any tanks or artillery either. But this approach is at least indicative that the Kremlin is more than happy to buy the equipment it needs if it's unable to produce it in Russia. Then add North Korea to the mix. According to South Korea's National Intelligence Service, or NIS, North Korea provided around 1 million missile shells spread across 10 shipments to Russia between the beginning of its war with Ukraine and November 2023. One member of South Korea's Parliamentary Intelligence Committee, Yoo Sang-bum, even claims that North Korea's munitions factories are running at maximum capacity to meet Russia's demand for military supplies. In return, Russia supposedly provides technical guidance related to developing satellites and intercontinental ballistic missiles. That North Korean involvement might have been crucial, especially amidst claims that Russia would have burned through its shells by December 2023, were it not for its ability to source them from other countries. Iran also appears to be offering a helping hand. In September 2023, Sky News reported that Ukrainian cities were blitzed with Shahed-136 drones built in Iran that wreaked havoc on power supplies before Ukrainian soldiers began shooting them down. There are also rumors of a supposed arms contract between Iran and Russia that suggests Moscow bought rockets and anti-tank shells worth around $1 million from Iran in September 2022. So it is clear that Russia is taking a page out of Ukraine's book. When supplies start running low, rely on your overseas allies to supplement your numbers. Nevertheless, Chinese components, North Korean shells, and Iranian drones aren't enough to replace the ever-diminishing tank, vehicle, and artillery numbers in Russia's military. And though Moscow is doing a good enough job of refurbishing its old stock right now, you have to wonder how long it can rely on that tactic. Old stock doesn't last forever, and if Russia wants to continue pushing its war in Ukraine, it appears it may need to find ways to increase production further or buy even more equipment from its allies to keep going. But what do you think? Are the reports of Russia's low equipment stocks overstated or inaccurate? Tell us what you think in the comments. Then check out Could Alliance of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran Destroy NATO? Or watch this video instead.